The morning Emmett Coker started digging his hole, it was already 90 degrees by 8 o'clock, and half of Kimble County drove out of their way to watch him do it. He was 71 that summer, thin as a fence rail, sun-dark, a straw hat gone soft at the brim. He walked his mule up the bald hillside behind his place, the one everybody called the Coker Slope, and he started to dig. Not a well, not a stock tank, just a hole. Straight down, on the meanest, driest, most worthless piece of ground in that part of Texas. By noon, he was in past his knees. By the second day, past his waist. Wendell Fry, who farmed the next section over, slowed his truck and leaned out the window and hollered, "Emmett, you lose something down there?" Emmett wiped his face. "Not yet." That was the whole conversation. They laughed about it at the feed store. Gentle laughing mostly, the kind you do about a man you respect, who's finally gone a little soft. A widower, digging a pit on ground the bank itself had called dead. Some said it was grief. Some said the heat had gotten into him. Nobody said a word to his face, because Emmett Coker was the sort of man who watched more than he spoke. And you don't waste words on a man who never spends his own. They were sure he was burying something out there. They were right. They just had it backwards, and in about 3 years, every last one of them was going to stand at his fence and see exactly how wrong they'd been. They were about to find out why. If stories of patience and quiet stubbornness and the wisdom old folks carry without ever raising their voice means something to you, take 1 second and subscribe. Join our farming family right here. And tell us down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd truly love to know whose porch light is on out there now. Back to the hillside. Because to understand the whole, you have to understand the 12 men who put him in it. The Coker place ran 340 acres in the rolling country of the Edwards Plateau, west of Junction, where the Llano River runs low and clear over pale limestone. Emmett's grandfather, Josiah Coker, broke ground there in 1887, when the grass still stood belly-high to a horse, and a man could believe the country would give forever. 3 generations worked it. Cattle, mostly. Some goats. A little dryland grain in the good years. The good years just kept coming less. The home pastures still held a thin skin of soil. But the north slope, the Coker slope, was bare as a kitchen table. The wind had carried the topsoil off decades back. What was left was pale and cracked and hard, a hardpan you could wring like pottery under a boot heel. When rain came, and it came seldom, the water ran off that slope like off a tin roof and cut brown gullies straight down to the road. That spring, Emmett had gone into town to borrow against the place. He was behind on everything, taxes, vet bills, the note on a tractor he'd finally bought and barely used. The Junction State Bank kept a loan committee in those days, and when land came up as collateral, they sent men to walk it. 12 of them walked the Coker Slope, bankers, a county appraiser. 2 ranchers the bank kept on to judge grass. 12 men in clean boots, standing on a dead hillside in a hot wind, and Emmett standing off to the side with his hat in his hands. The appraiser wrote 1 word in his book. Then he read it out loud, so there'd be no argument. Worthless. Harlan Boyd, the bank president, was a fair man and not a cruel one. He told Emmett straight, not out of meanness, but because he believed it was true. "That ground won't grow a shadow, Emmett. I'm sorry. I can't lend $1 against it." Emmett didn't argue. Didn't say a word. He thanked them for their time. And he watched 12 trucks roll back down the road in a long tail of dust. Then he stood alone on the slope a good while. And then he went to the barn and got his shovel. Here's what those 12 men in clean boots didn't know. Emmett Coker knew something about that hillside they didn't. He'd known it for 50 years, and he had it in writing. Josiah Coker had kept a ledger. Not just cattle and prices, but the land itself in a cramped pencil hand. And folded into the back of it, gone soft as cloth, was a government bulletin from the Soil Conservation Service, printed in 1938, 3 years after they founded that agency to keep the whole southern plains from blowing clean away. His grandfather had gotten it from a serviceman who came through in the Dust Bowl years. A soil man named Kessler, who wore a necktie into the field and knelt down in the dirt and talked about the ground like it was a living animal. Something you could starve or feed. Kessler told Josiah one thing the old man wrote down twice, so you know it mattered. He said, "The trouble with this country isn't that it doesn't rain. It's that the ground can't keep the rain it gets." Emmett had read that ledger every winter of his life, by lamplight, the way other men read scripture. So he knew, bone deep, what lay under his dead hillside, and he knew it wasn't dead, it was locked. Now let me tell you what he was actually doing down in that hole, because it's real, and it's the whole reason this story turns. Under the dry soils of that country lies a layer called caliche, a hard pan, a crust of calcium carbonate that hardens over centuries into something close to concrete. Water can't sink through it, roots can't push through it. So when rain hits a slope like Emmett's, it strikes that sealed layer a foot or two down, finds nowhere to go, and slides off sideways, carrying the last of the topsoil with it. The land looks dead, but underneath that pan, there's often older subsoil, damp and mineral-rich, water that fell in wetter years and got trapped and held down there in the dark. A bank vault full of moisture, with the door welded shut. Break the door, and everything changes. Emmett dug 6 feet down for one reason, to put his hand on the proof, to feel with his own fingers that below the hard pan, the ground was cool and damp and alive. And when he found it was, he did the real work. He didn't dig one hole. He cut long, shallow trenches on the contour, running dead level across the face of the slope, following the shape of the land instead of the fall of it. And along every one of those lines he broke the caliche, over and over, chipping through that sealed crust so the water would finally have a door. The idea is old, and it's simple as a prayer. Slow the water, spread it, sink it. A contour line catches the rain and holds it in place long enough to soak down through the broken pan into the subsoil, where the sun can never steal it back, and into those trenches he worked everything he owned that would rot, brush, old hay. Manure from the pens, the sweepings of 40 years. Because organic matter in the ground is a sponge, and this part is real. For every single 1% of it, you build into an acre of soil. That acre can hold something like 20,000 more gallons of water. He was building a reservoir he would likely never live to see. Underground. On land 12 men had called worthless. And then he seeded it. Not with corn, with the grasses that belonged there, the ones his grandfather remembered standing belly-high. Pseudoatsgrama, little blue stem, deep-rooted natives that drive roots down 8, 10, 12 feet, clean past the broken pan and into the water bank, so that in a killing dry year they drink from a well the shallow-rooted plants can't even reach. That was the whole plan. A dying man, teaching a hillside to keep its own rain. It did not go smoothly. Lord, it did not. The first stretch of trench he cut, the walls slumped in within a week, and the caliche dulled his tools down to nothing. He resharpened them by lamplight and started over. He didn't complain. He didn't explain himself. That was his way. Then that fall a real rain came. A gully washer, 4 inches in a single night. He'd prayed it would fill his lines and prove him right. Instead, it came too hard and too fast, and it tore through his young contours and washed a whole season of work down to the road in a brown flood. Wendell Fry found him the next morning, standing in the mud looking at the ruin. "Maybe it's telling you something." "Emmett," Wendell said, not unkind, just tired for him. "It is," Emmett said, and he bent down and picked up the shovel. He rebuilt them wider, slower, better. The third blow was the cruelest, because it was his own doing. A gate blew open in a norther, and his cattle got up onto the fresh seeded slope and trampled and grazed the young grass down to bare dirt in a single night. Months of work gone in an evening. An old man could be forgiven for quitting, right there. He didn't. He mended the gate, reseeded what he could, and fenced that slope off with his own 2 hands. Post by post, through a cold and bitter December, Alvin Prewitt, the retired cabinet maker, 70 years old, the man who'd built the pews for the Methodist Church, came out and helped him set the corners for nothing. because he liked Emmett and figured a friend didn't need a better reason than that. When folks asked Alvin what in the world Emmett was up to out there, Alvin would just say, "Building something," and leave it right there. For 2 more years the slope came up thin and green and quiet, and hardly a soul paid it any mind. Grass isn't a spectacle. It doesn't announce itself. Then the sky changed. It came on slow, the way the worst things always do. The winter of 1950 was dry. The spring was drier. And by 1952, every man in Kimble County could feel the country pulling tight, the tanks dropping, the wells starting to cough air. The old-timers began reading the signs the way their fathers had. Alvin Prewitt stood in Emmett's yard one evening and looked north at a sky the color of old brass, and he said, "Lo, this one's gonna stay a while." He'd seen it in the 30s. He knew that look in the sky. And the animals knew before any of the men did. The cattle bunched along the fence lines and lowed at nothing at all. The deer came down out of the hills weeks too early, thin, walking the roads in broad daylight. And the killdeer that had nested by the tank every spring of memory that year simply never came back. What settled over Texas then was not a dry spell. It was the drought of record, the worst in the state's history, 7 years long. The time, folks would say for the rest of their lives, that it just never rained. It broke ranches that had stood since before the war. It emptied whole counties. It turned grass to gray powder and rivers to cracked white stone. And it did the one thing a great drought always does. It told the truth about every acre it touched. The fry place went first, the way most of them did. Wendell's grass burned off to dust by that second summer and blew away on the wind. His tanks went to dried mud, cracked into plates you could pick up like broken crockery. He sold half his herd for pennies because he had not one thing left to feed them. Up and down the Junction Road it was the same story. Bare ground, dust hanging in the heat. The country that one word had promised, spreading out everywhere, finally coming true. Everywhere but one hillside. The Coker slope held green, not lush. Nothing on earth was lush that year, but a broad, standing band of grass, side oats and blue stem, gone gold-green and knee-high, roots down deep in a water bank an old man had built with a shovel and a dead man's ledger. His cattle grazed it, while his neighbors starved in the dirt. And at the very foot of the slope, where the sunk water finally worked its way back to the surface, the ground stayed damp enough that a little seep ran clear over the limestone in the cool of the morning. When every other spring in that whole country had gone to dust, word gets around. It always does. One evening in the 3rd year of the drought, a car came slow up the Coker Road and stopped at the fence. Harlan Boyd got out, older now, and he hadn't come as a banker. He'd come the way a man comes to look at something he cannot account for. He stood at that fence a long, long time. He looked at the green slope, at the grazing cattle, at the wet stone at the bottom of it. And then he turned and looked out across the road, at the dead brown country running clean to the horizon, the country he'd been so right about. Everywhere but here, Emmett walked down and stood beside him. Neither man said a thing for a while. Just 2 old men at a fence. Then Harlan Boyd said it. "I was wrong, that was all," Emmett nodded. Nobody made a speech about it. After a minute, Harlan got back in his car and drove home, and it was enough. But here's the part I most want you to hear. Because it wasn't just Harlan. Over that next long year, one by one they came. The county appraiser, the one who'd read out that single word, drove out and stood at the fence and never said much of anything at all. The 2 ranchers who judged the grass. The younger bankers, older now themselves. Not all at once, not on any given day, but over time, near every one of the 12 men who had walked that slope in clean boots and called it worthless came back. Quiet, hats in their hands, to stand and look at what one stubborn old man had grown out of the ground they'd condemned. Emmett never gloated. Not once. It wasn't in him. The next season, quiet as anything, it started to spread. Wendell Fry showed up one morning and asked, not quite able to look Emmett in the eye, if he'd come walk his slope and show him where to cut the lines. Then a young rancher from over by Roosevelt, Then Roy Latham, the county extension agent, 42 years old, who'd studied it all in school but had never once seen it done with a man's own hands, and who started carrying photographs of the Coker slope to every meeting he held for the rest of his career. Emmett never lectured a soul. He'd just go out with a man and kneel down in the dirt, the way the serviceman Kessler had done 50 years before, and break a little caliche with his bare hand, and show him the damp underneath. Nobody organized it. Nobody put it in the paper. It just spread. The way useful things do. George Washington Carver, who spent his whole life on his knees in the soil, listening to it, once said, "Anything will give up its secrets if you love it enough." That old man on the hillside had loved a piece of dead ground enough to dig 6 feet down and find out it was never dead at all. And I've come to believe the grass was never really the point. The grass was just the proof. What Emmett Coker actually grew out on that slope was harder to see, and it was this, that the thing everyone drives right past and calls worthless is most often only locked, not lost. And the only difference between the two is a person patient enough to kneel down and pay attention and keep quiet while they do the work. 12 men read the surface and wrote one word. One old man read what was underneath. So let me ask you something before you go tonight. Have you ever been doubted for something you knew in your bones was right? Something you couldn't explain to the people standing there laughing, so you just went quiet and did the work anyway? I would truly like to hear about it. Tell us your story down in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from tonight, because we read every single one. Everyone. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, true-to-life tales from the land and the quiet people who work it, then stay with us here and subscribe. There's always another hillside, and always someone stubborn enough to dig.